India makes progress on its human spaceflight program. US President Donald Trump revives some old space defense plans. A European company starts its own 4K livestream from space. And NASA discovers the building blocks of life on an asteroid of all places. As always, we'll have all that and more this week in Spaceflight. NASA scientists have identified some of the chemical building blocks for life in the samples returned from asteroid Bennu. Now, if you remember, NASA's OSIRIS-REx mission collected a sample of the asteroid in late 2020. It stored this sample in a capsule that then returned to Earth in September of 2023. After opening the capsule later that year, NASA announced that OSIRIS-REx had collected a total of 121.6 grams of material. That may not sound like much, but it's more than twice the amount that NASA needed. Scientists are now analyzing some of the material, and this week, some major results came in. NSF's Patrick O'Loughlin spoke with some of the scientists who worked on these studies.
We literally took the pebbles, the dark beach sand, and we put it in a test tube with water, sealed it, and boiled it at 100 degrees C. So we literally made Bennu tea. We extracted the organic compounds into this tea, and that's where we discovered, 10,000 different organic molecules. So it's really a complex soup of organic molecules that would have been available on the early Earth and elsewhere for the original life.
Among these organic compounds were all 5 nucleobases that store the genetic code for life on Earth in DNA and RNA. What's more, the team also found amino acids in the asteroid material. Amino acids chain together to make up proteins. There are many different amino acids, but life on Earth uses 20 to build proteins, and scientists found 14 of them in the material collected by OSIRIS-REx. With these amino acids and the 5 nucleobases, Bennu contains some of the most important chemical building blocks for life. But there's also something interesting going on with these amino acids.
Amino acids themselves come in kind of 2 flavors, just like your hands, left-handed and right-handed, and they're non-superimposable mirror images. So as you put your hands down, the thumbs stick out, amino acids are the same. Now, all life on Earth uses exclusively the left-handed form. So if these samples had been contaminated, we should have seen more of the left-handed form, and we didn't. We saw equal mixture. So these things are basically as clean as you can get with respect to contamination.
But the even mix of left-handed and right-handed amino acids didn't just mean that the sample wasn't contaminated. Scientists aren't sure why life on Earth only uses left-handed amino acids, and they believe that life can also be possible with the mirrored forms. But we've never seen that mirrored life, so it's kind of puzzling. There was a hypothesis that the early solar system contained more left-handed amino acids than right-handed, but Bennu's sample means some bad news for that hypothesis. Bennu was selected as the target for OSIRIS-REx specifically because it contains material from the early solar system, so if that shows an even split, something else must be responsible for the left-handed life that we're used to. But that's something for the scientific community to work out in the future. Another interesting find among the thousands of organic compounds was ammonia, and lots of it.
The finding of really high abundances of ammonia in the Bennu samples was another big surprise, actually. We weren't expecting that. We've analyzed samples from another asteroid Ryugu, collected by the Hayabusa 2 mission. There wasn't a lot of ammonia in those samples, very depleted. But in Bennu, we're seeing like 75 times higher than the levels we're seeing in Ryugu. To put it in perspective, it's about 100 times the levels you'd find in your backyard soil. So this is a high amount of ammonia. Now, ammonia is important for biological processes. It's part of the nitrogen cycle. It's actually an important building block for the formation of amino acids and nucleobases, the building blocks of life, so it's critical.
There could have, however, been another source of ammonia on Bennu, and that's the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft itself. It uses hydrazine as fuel for its thrusters, and that happens to produce ammonia when the thrusters fire. So how do we know that the ammonia on Bennu wasn't just brought from Earth?
We had the foresight in 2016 to collect some of the fuel that was loaded on the spacecraft to analyze it right here for its isotopic ratio of measured in hydrogen. We're able to compare the data we got in 2016 with the data from the ammonia and say that they are definitely different. So it is not contamination from the spacecraft. It is a different isotopic ratio that came from the outer solar system.
And to be extra sure about their results, the scientists performed the same study on control samples where they knew what results to expect.
And so because we're good scientists, here's Bennu, Here's our negative control of a fused silica that was heated in an oven at 500 degrees C overnight to burn off all the organics. And there's our positive control of enriched meteorite.
If the study said that the negative control contained organic compounds, they'd know something was wrong. And the other way around, if their study found no organic compounds on the positive control, something would be very wrong as well. Well, both controls gave the results that the scientists expected, so they are very confident in their results. While this team analyzed organic compounds in Bennu samples, another team of scientists studied the samples for salt crystals. They found types of salt crystals that have never been seen before in meteorites, but are occasionally found on Earth in places like Searles Lake in the Mojave Desert. The same minerals are also present on the dwarf planet Ceres and Saturn's moon Enceladus. The scientists believe that these crystals can only be present in the OSIRIS-REx samples if Bennu's parent asteroid had flows of brine underneath its surface. The salts in this brine could have then helped to form organic molecules like the ones found by the other team. The two studies published this week are only some of the first results from the Bennu samples, but they've already surprised scientists and shown that there's much more to be found. And fortunately, OSIRIS-REx brought back much more material than expected.
We didn't bring back any huge boulders or anything, but we brought back about a cup full, so 120 grams, which was twice the amount that we were required to bring back. And like I said, we've only analyzed a few tens of milligrams, very small percentage of what was returned. And it's amazing how many scientific discoveries we have from such a small amount of sample. So I'm really looking forward to the future. This 70% of this returned sample will be archived, saved. Some of it's been frozen in a freezer, and will probably be opened, 5 decades from now. And folks will have an opportunity to study it with techniques that don't even exist in our laboratories today. So there's going to be so much new information that we're going to learn about the history of Bennu and the parent body from these really precious samples.
For the last decade or so, India has slowly been working on a human spaceflight program of its own using the country's Gaganyaan spacecraft. As part of that program, India is expected to conduct the first uncrewed orbital flight of the Gaganyaan spacecraft in the coming months. This week, the capsule was fitted with the propulsion system that will be used to control its attitude during re-entry through the atmosphere on its return to Earth. This installation took place at the Liquid Propulsion Systems Center within the Indian Space Research Organization, India's own space agency. There, engineers also installed the crew module uprighting system, which will aid in keeping the capsule upright after splashdown. The crew module is now being moved to the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center to receive its avionics package assembly and electrical harnessing. From there, it's planned to go to the U.R. Rao Satellite Center for final integration before launch. Once all of this work is complete, the capsule should be headed to the launch site, where it'll be integrated with its service module and crew escape system ahead of stacking with its launch vehicle, a human-rated Launch Vehicle Mark III. Last month, ISRO confirmed that the stacking of this rocket had started at the Satish Dhawan Space Center ahead of this historic first demonstration mission. Now, as to when an Indian astronaut will actually ride on Gaganyaan, that'll take a bit more time. After this mission, India plans at least another 2 uncrewed test flights before putting any humans on board, so this could mean a crewed flight test may not happen until well into next year. But well before that, India will be flying one of their own on the Axiom 4 mission to the International Space Station. This week, NASA confirmed that the agency and its international partners have given the green light for the launch of the Axiom 4 mission in spring of this year. The mission, launching on a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft atop a Falcon 9 rocket, will be carrying a crew of 4 to the ISS for a 2-week stay at the orbiting outpost. The mission will be commanded by former NASA astronaut and director of human spaceflight at Axiom Space, Peggy Whitson, who previously flew on the Axiom 2 mission and will again be participating on this mission. Her pilot will be Shubhanshu Shukla, one of the 4 astronauts selected by India in 2024 to fly as part of the country's human spaceflight program. His flight was arranged as part of the ongoing cooperation between India and the United States to further strengthen the relations of both countries in space. Alongside Whitson and Shukla will be 2 European astronauts, Sławomir Uznainski from Poland and Tibor Kapu from Hungary. Uznainski is flying as a European Space Agency project astronaut, while Kapu's flight is directly sponsored by the Hungarian government. This green light gives the go-ahead for all parties involved to prepare for a launch in the spring, which means we're likely going to see up to 3 Crew Dragon flights in quick succession between Crew 10, From 2, and this mission. Over time, space is becoming a hostile environment, and it's not because of its inherently risky and hazardous nature, but rather because of humans. The last decade saw an increase in the use of space as a warfighting domain, from anti-satellite weapons tests to testing the hijacking of satellites, and even testing the deployment of warheads directly from orbit. Many countries are developing space-based defense systems that can detect these and stop them in their tracks before they can harm anyone, so it's no surprise that among the several executive orders that US President Donald Trump has signed, one focused on the reinforcement of US defense in space. But before we go into that in particular, we have to rewind to 2019 when Trump's first administration established the Space Development Agency, an agency under the US Space Force that's in charge of developing constellations of space-based defense systems and military communications. This agency started what it calls the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, which is a mega constellation of satellites of different types split into layers and deployed in batches that are called tranches. These layers include the transport and tracking layer, which already started deploying in 2023 via 2 Falcon 9 launches and are meant to support communications and the tracking of missiles and hypersonic vehicles. Other layers, such as the deterrence layer and custody layer, are planned for launch later in the decade and will provide situational awareness on the ground and in space for the US military and allied countries. In 2020, President Biden's administration kept these programs and even expanded on them by adding more tranches and launches to the system. The new executive order signed by Trump this week requests that the US Secretary of Defense submit an updated architecture and plan for a next-generation missile defense shield within 60 days. While some of these defense capabilities are specifically for short-range and therefore ground-based defense, some of the requirements ask for more space-based capabilities. These include, for example, the acceleration of the hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor layer, one of the other upcoming layers to the Space Development Agency's mega constellation. This layer will work from low Earth orbit to track hypersonic vehicles, specifically those that are classed as hypersonic glide vehicles, which are particularly harder to detect and track in real time as they can quickly change course during their glide phase. The program is currently in its prototype phase, and just last year, it launched 2 prototype satellites on the USSF-124 mission on board a Falcon 9 rocket. The executive order is therefore asking for an acceleration of this program to put it into operational action as soon as possible. One of the requirements also includes the development and deployment of proliferated space-based interceptors capable of boost phase intercept. Or in other words, the development and deployment of spacecraft that can intercept missiles and other threats while they're on their way to their targets. Now, this would be a more active approach where, rather than detecting or aiding in the tracking of a threat, it would directly eliminate it from space. Some of you watching might think that that sounds a lot like the Strategic Defense Initiative presented by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, often nicknamed Star Wars. This program presented various ways of tracking and destroying threats from space well before they could reach their target, with the idea that by developing such a program, nuclear weapons would essentially be useless. If they can just be destroyed, the enemy wouldn't even try to launch them at all.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant US retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Some of the options initially studied included actual weapons like lasers and other systems that could remotely affect the threat and eliminate it. This proved to be a lot harder to develop than previously thought, though, and other simpler ideas gained more traction, such as the space-based interceptors idea. Still, this necessitated capabilities not present at the time, but that are now a reality. Things like low-cost launches, high launch cadence, and proliferated satellite systems, also known as mega constellations. The program eventually ended in the early 1990s, both because of what was seen as insurmountable engineering challenges, and also because the Cold War had ended and the threat of a nuclear war was seen as much lower than when the program began. Even now, though, despite all of the changes in the space industry over the last 30 years, some of these challenges still remain, and it's going to take a while until the systems are developed. But one thing is for sure, we certainly hope that these capabilities will never have to be put to use in a real scenario. Right now, as I speak, there are 2 moon-bound lunar landers, and we've been covering their progress at NSF since their launch just 2 weeks ago. In the last week, there have been a few more updates about them, and we've got some other lunar landers in the news now as well. So let's take a look at those. Let's begin with Firefly's Blue Ghost lander, which remains in orbit around the Earth as planned. On January 24th, the spacecraft performed a short correction burn using its reaction control thrusters to increase its apogee, or its highest point in its orbit around the Earth. This adjusted the lander's orbit, keeping it on track for a translunar injection burn a few weeks from now. Firefly says the burn was so accurate that engineers think that there won't even be a need for another burn as originally planned. During this phase of the mission, where the lander is orbiting the Earth, Blue Ghost has been snapping pictures and videos showing views of our home planet in high definition. But of course, the lander isn't there to just take pretty pictures. While it orbits the Earth, it's using this time to check its systems and activate its payloads before it heads to the moon. Some of these payloads have even already begun to return data. For instance, there's the Lunar GNSS Receiver Experiment, or LUGRA, a payload jointly developed by NASA and the Italian Space Agency, which aims to demonstrate the use of global navigation satellites for navigation in cislunar space. The experiment was able to accurately calculate the location of Blue Ghost from a distance of 331,000 kilometers from Earth, demonstrating that these navigation systems can also be used in cislunar space. On board the lander is also an experiment called Stereo Cameras for Lunar Plume Surface Studies, or SCALPS, which is a set of cameras mounted near the aft end of the lander. These look down on the engine and are aimed to study the interaction between the engine's exhaust plume and the lunar surface. In the meantime, the other lunar lander in space, iSpace's Hokuto R lander, named Resilience, keeps orbiting the Earth. This week, the company confirmed the lander remains in excellent health and it continues to send data and pictures to the ground. They also shared a picture of Earth taken on January 25th while the lander was about 10,000 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. Furthermore, the company confirmed that one of its payloads, the Deep Space Radiation Probe, was already sending data back to Earth. This payload is from the National Central University of Taiwan and is meant to collect and send radiation data through different environments during the course of the flight, including in deep space and from the lunar surface. Here on Earth, another lunar lander is gearing up for launch. Intuitive Machines' Athena lander recently arrived at the Kennedy Space Center for integration and preparation for liftoff. The lander is set to launch no earlier than February 27th at 2 minutes past midnight UTC from Launch Complex 39A on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The lander will be integrated along with other ride shares flying on the mission, including NASA's Lunar Trailblazer spacecraft and AstroForge's Odin, a spacecraft that we covered on last week's episode. After integration with the payload dispenser, the payloads will then be encapsulated on a Falcon 9 fairing and transported to the launch pad for integration with its rocket. Intuitive Machines' lander is unique in that it uses cryogenic propellants, liquid methane and liquid oxygen, instead of storable propellants for in-space propulsion. In order to reduce boil-off, SpaceX fills the lander's tanks with propellant during the countdown using dedicated liquid methane and liquid oxygen commodities at 39A, a feature that forces the launch to happen from that historic launch pad. Once launched, Athena will take a 4-day trip to the moon and will target a landing near the Shackleton crater. One interesting difference compared to Intuitive Machines' first mission is that this lander will be carrying a hopper on board, nicknamed Micronova. The spacecraft will be deployed by Athena and will aim to hop into a permanently shadowed crater at the lunar South Pole to explore the presence and quantity of ice water in these locations. But this week we had even more lunar lander news with the announcement that the European Space Agency, or ESA, has selected Thales Alenia Space to develop and build the Argonaut lunar lander. Argonaut is a lunar lander proposed by ESA that aims to land large amounts of cargo on the moon in support of NASA's Artemis program. The lander will be capable of landing up to 2 metric tons of cargo on the lunar surface and remotely deploy them via the use of a robotic arm. The first flight of an Argonaut lander is currently scheduled to take place in 2031, and it'll be the first lunar lander developed and built in Europe. For an even more in-depth look at the future of lunar landers, check out NSF's article, released just a few days ago and written by our own writer, Martijn Luinstra. Now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with a look from space itself. London-based company Sen has launched a 4K video live stream from space. The stream is from the company's own high-resolution cameras installed on the exterior of the Columbus module on the International Space Station. These cameras live stream for 20 out of 24 hours a day, which is when the company has live downlink from them. During the remaining 4 hours of the day, the stream shows replays of other clips captured with the cameras at other times. According to the company, quote, "Sen's vision is to democratize space using video to inform, educate, inspire, and benefit all humanity. This 4K stream is just one of the many steps of the company's programs, and they're aiming to launch even more cameras next year." Next week, NSF will be hosting a live interview with Sen CEO Charles Black as part of our ongoing series called Europe's Future in Space, so be sure to keep your eyes peeled for that and don't miss it. This week, SpaceX and VAST have announced that they're teaming up to offer research opportunities in orbit. These opportunities were initially offered by SpaceX on its own about a year ago when the company debuted a human spaceflight page on its website, opening itself up to offers to fly experimental payloads and researchers on free-flying Dragon missions or even on missions to the ISS. This week's announcement, however, included VAST in the equation, and the form used to submit proposals now includes VAST as well. These opportunities will still make use of SpaceX's Dragon, but now also add the possibility of flying to VAST's own space station, Haven 1. It's definitely not surprising to see both companies teaming up in this manner, given that Haven 1 will launch on SpaceX's Falcon 9, and that it's meant to be serviced by Crew Dragon capsules. So who knows? Maybe in the future, they may even team up for bigger programs too. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, we had a Starlink mission on January 27th. Falcon 9 lifted off at 22:05 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. Of the 21 Starlink V2 mini satellites that were added to the constellation, 13 had direct-to-cell capability. The booster on this mission was B-1076, which flew for the 20th time and became the 9th booster to do so. It ended its mission by successfully landing on SpaceX's drone ship, a short fall of gravitas. With this mission, SpaceX has now launched a total of 7,821 Starlink satellites. Of these, 827 satellites have re-entered, and 6,243 have moved into their operational orbits. Next, we had a mission launch from India. On January 29th at 53 minutes past midnight Universal Time, a Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle, or GSLV, lit its solid core and liquid side booster engines and lifted off from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. According to ISRO, this was the 100th launch since India established its spaceport on the Sriharikota Island. To get to that number, however, you have to include some of the suborbital experimental missions and disregard the more than 500 suborbital sounding rockets that have launched from the complex. This week's mission carried a regional navigation satellite into geostationary transfer orbit. Once the satellite has reached its operational orbit, it can be used for navigation on mobile phones, just like GPS. But since it's in a geostationary orbit, it'll only be available in the Indian subcontinent. Back in Florida, we had another Falcon 9 launch on January 30th. Falcon 9 lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at 1:34 UTC with the SpainSat NG-1 in its fairing. This satellite will provide secure communication for governments and emergency response teams throughout Europe. The NG in the satellite's name stands for New Generation, and this is the first of 2 satellites that will replace the current SpainSat and XTAR EUR satellite. The second will be launched no earlier than September of this year. The booster on this mission was B-1073, which flew for its final time as it was intentionally expended, wrapping up an impressive career of 21 flights. These missions included, among others, 13 Starlink flights, a CRS-27 cargo mission to the International Space Station, and the first Hakuto-R mission to the Moon. Closing out the week, we had a spacewalk on the International Space Station. On January 30th, NASA astronauts Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore put on their EVA suits and opened the hatch on the station's airlock at 12:43 Universal Time. Sunny went out for a ride on the end of the station's robotic Canadarm, which moved her into position so that she could remove a radio antenna from the station's truss. This was Sunny's 9th spacewalk, and it proved to be a special one. She's now the female astronaut with the longest time spent spacewalking at 62 hours and 6 minutes total, breaking the previous record held by Peggy Whitson by nearly 2 hours. While Sunny was out there doing work and breaking records, Butch was on a quest of his own. He was tasked with taking samples around some vents on the station's exterior to see if microbes sometimes escape from the station, as well as if they survive and how far they make it into the space environment. The astronauts wrapped up their 5 5-hour and 25-minute spacewalk at 18:09 UTC. Going into next week, we'll have a Starlink launch on February 1st. This mission will take off from Vandenberg in California and deliver 22 Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit. The 4-hour window for this mission opens at 22:48 UTC. We'll also have a launch from Japan this week. On February 2nd, an H3 rocket is set to lift off from the beautiful Tanegashima Space Center to deliver the Michibiki 6 satellite into a geostationary transfer orbit. The satellite is part of the Quasi-Zenith satellite system, which provides navigation and positioning services. T0 for this mission is expected during a 2-hour window, opening at 8:30 UTC. Next up, we'll have another Starlink mission from Florida. Falcon 9 will deliver another batch of direct-to-cell satellites to low Earth orbit. The 4-hour launch window opens on February 3rd at 8:54 Universal Time. Later that day, an Electron is set to lift off from Rocket Lab Spaceport in New Zealand at 20:43 UTC. The payload for this mission is a batch of 5 Internet of Things, or IoT, satellites for the French company Kinéis. It's the 4th and penultimate launch for the constellation of 25, so Rocket Lab is calling the mission IoT for You and Me. A few hours later, another Falcon 9 is expected to lift off from Florida. This time, the rocket will lift 2 Earth observation satellites into low Earth orbit for Maxar's Worldview Legion constellation. The window for this launch opens on February 3rd at 23:32 Universal Time and lasts for about an hour. The booster will come back to the Cape for a return to launch site landing, so expect some sonic booms if you're in the area. And wrapping up the week on February 4th, Blue Origin plans to fly its New Shepard rocket. This flight was originally set to fly last week, but Blue scrubbed it after some issues popped up with the booster's avionics. The capsule's loaded with 29 science and technology experiments, and an additional payload is attached to the booster for a total of 30 payloads, many of them provided by NASA. Blue Origin plans to do something special compared to other New Shepard missions, as the capsule will spin at 11 revolutions per minute to simulate lunar gravity. The window for this flight opens on February 4th at 15:30 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.